Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. When I decided to reread Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in October, it wasn't just because it's one of my favorite horror novels. It's because I wanted to revisit what is arguably the most important horror story ever written in the year that one of my favorite directors, Guillermo del Toro, brings his dream adaptation of Frankenstein to life on screen. And in the lead up to the film, and after finishing my reread over the course of a weekend, I found an episode of NPR On Point discussing what Frankenstein can teach us in the age of AI. And that podcast was the inspiration for this video. I was initially planning to just review the novel in my monthly wrap-up, but I was just so inspired in writing and kept rambling about the book to a point where that video would have been way longer than I would want. So this video is a bit different than what I would normally make. I wanted to discuss the themes of Shelley's novel, the Del Toro adaptation, in the context of our modern day and the rapid rise of artificial intelligence. For me, it's almost impossible not to see this story as prophetic and a cautionary tale. It feels less like a gothic relic and more like a mirror, reflecting every era's technological ambitions and moral blind spots back at us. Most people know Frankenstein through its many film adaptations over the years. The green-skinned, bolt-necked monster pursued by townspeople with pitchforks, but the novel is nothing like that. Shelley's Frankenstein is written in layered first-person narratives, framed like a story within a story. We begin with letters from an Arctic explorer writing to his sister, then Victor Frankenstein tells his story, and finally, the intelligent and well-spoken creature has his say. When you strip away the myth and iconography of the film adaptations, Frankenstein is really a story about isolation and unregulated ambition and hubris. Victor Frankenstein's desire to conquer death is framed not as villainy but as obsession, an almost noble curiosity that escalates into something horrific. The tragedy isn't just that he creates life, but that he abandons it. And that's where Shelley's genius lies. To me, the horror isn't the act of creation, it's the failure of responsibility that follows it. Every time I read Frankenstein, I'm struck by how moving the creature's story is. When he first awakens, he's not a monster, he's innocent, even childlike. He observes the world around him with wonder, trying to learn language, morality, emotion. He's rejected again and again, and the more he learns, the more he suffers. At one point, he reaches Paradise Lost, and at first identifies with Adam, the first man made by the Creator, but later, heartbreakingly, he says, "I am rather the fallen angel." The line, "Misery made me a fiend," is one of the most devastating in the novel because it captures the book's entire moral philosophy in 5 words. Evil isn't born, it's made through neglect, cruelty, and loneliness. Mary Shelley's creature isn't a villain, he's a victim of abandonment, a reflection of what happens when creation is divorced from compassion. It is also a distinctly feminist idea. Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the earliest advocates for women's rights, and that influence runs deep within this novel. If Victor Frankenstein's great transgression is to create life without a woman, to circumvent the natural process of birth, then Frankenstein becomes, in part, a parable about men trying to control creation itself. The creature's suffering is born from a world that doesn't know how to nurture, only to dominate. The book's subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, is one key to understanding it. In Greek mythology, Prometheus gave fire to humanity and was punished by the gods for it. Fire symbolizes knowledge, creation, and defiance, and in Shelley's novel, science becomes that same forbidden flame. Victor Frankenstein's fire is the spark of life itself. Creating life from death, he dares to harness it, but without the wisdom or empathy to handle it. Shelley turns this gothic tale into a moral allegory about the dangers of ambitions untempered by conscience or ethics. And what's truly haunting is that the novel doesn't have a clean resolution. Victor dies consumed by guilt, the creature disappears into the wilderness, and the cycle of suffering feels endless. There's no redemption for Victor, only reflection. That ambiguity is why Frankenstein has endured, because it doesn't give answers but asks a lot of questions. Like, what does it mean to be human? When I saw Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, I was curious how he would tackle the question. Del Toro has always been drawn to monsters that reflect our own broken humanity. From Pan's Labyrinth to The Shape of Water, he explored the idea that monstrosity and beauty can coexist. In his Frankenstein, he leans into that tradition. His creature isn't a lumbering brute, he's articulate and sensitive. Famed contemporary horror author of the book Mexican Gothic, Silvia Moreno Garcia, writes in a New York Times opinion piece that Del Toro's Frankenstein adaptation is not really a horror film, it's an emotional story. It's not about the terror of creation, but the tragedy of rejection. Jacob Elordi's creature is tall and scarred, but not grotesque as other cinematic adaptations. His intelligence, sensitivity, and yearning for acceptance are foregrounded in a way that feels true to Shelley's original vision. Moreno Garcia makes a fascinating point in her piece that over time we have disfigured Shelley's story. The 1931 James Whale film gave us a mute, square-headed monster, and every adaptation since has copied that image. What once was a story of parenthood and abandonment became a spectacle about violence and horror. Del Toro's version reverses that. His film reclaims a lot of the soul of the Frankenstein novel, the creature's humanity, his longing for love, and the unbearable pain of being unloved. What Del Toro adds, though, is context. His version takes place in an industrial world on the cusp of modernity, a world obsessed with invention, with speed, with progress at any cost. There's even a subtle nod to the way tech capital today fuels hubris. A benefactor, played by Christoph Waltz, who funds Victor's research, was never a character or element in Mary Shelley's original work. Del Toro has stated in interviews that his concerns is not artificial intelligence, but natural stupidity and the blindness of creators who don't imagine consequences. He thinks that's what drives the world's worst features. I take this as him thinking the real moral of Frankenstein isn't don't play God, it's don't abandon your creation. Whether those creations are children, technologies, or systems, the danger isn't making them, it's in refusing to care for them once they exist, or considering the consequences of improper care. Del Toro's film captures that sentiment from the novel perfectly, in my opinion. Reading Frankenstein in 2025, I couldn't help but draw parallels to artificial intelligence, as Del Toro has in interviews. Victor Frankenstein's experiment was essentially a theoretical form of AI, the attempt to create intelligence and autonomy from lifeless matter, in this case formerly living matter. The creature's tragedy is that he becomes what the world believes him to be. He begins innocent and curious to understand the world around him, but every time he reaches out, he's met with fear. And so becomes the thing they call him, a monster. That transformation is what makes Frankenstein so timeless. Because the story isn't about the danger of science per se, it's about the dangers of neglect. In a modern frame, think of how this mirrors the technologies we build. AI systems are unleashed without sufficient oversight or with algorithms trained on biased data that perpetuates discrimination. In The New Age of Sexism, How AI and Emerging Technologies Are Reinventing Misogyny, Laura Bates warns that algorithms we design inherit our biases. They replicate the inequalities and prejudices of their creators, often amplifying words. In other words, our creatures are becoming reflections of our worst selves. If we don't ground creation with ethics, we bake in injustice. It's the same moral dilemma Shelley posed in 1818. What happens when we create something in our own image but fail to take responsibility for its moral development? If the creature is a mirror of Victor's soul, what does AI mirror back to us? Shelley was writing during the Industrial Revolution, a time when machines were beginning to replace human labor, and people were already asking what humanity meant in a world increasingly ruled by inventions. Today, that question has returned with a new urgency. So what do I think Frankenstein teaches us 2 centuries later? First, that progress without ethics and empathy is dangerous. Victor's failure isn't that he wanted to understand and create life, it's that he never considered what his creation needed once it existed. In tech terms, building models, algorithms, synthetic beings without embedding fairness, oversight, and empathy is reckless. Otherwise, we create monsters. Second, that a creator is responsible for what they created. Victor abandons his creature, and the creature kills in pain and anger. In AI, if you build a system, you can't just flip it on and walk away. How is the system taught, monitored, and cared for? How does it reflect your values? If you don't address the risks, you invite tragedy. Third, that the things we make, our technologies, and even our social systems will always reflect our moral character. If we build them carelessly, they will inherit our flaws. The creature is not simply evil, he is shaped by neglect. Similarly, tech isn't neutral. If we train it on racism, misogyny, and hate, it will reflect it back. Laura Bates' research shows how misogyny, as well as other forms of bias on the basis of race or sexual orientation, is already embedded in emerging tech. For example, generative AI models such as ChatGPT proliferating misinformation utilizing talking points of so-called incel ideologies. AI technology is being so rampantly and easily used for sexual abuse through deepfake pornography, but there has not been urgent political or societal action to criminalize or prevent such acts as this technology proliferates. And beyond technology, what gives Frankenstein its timeless power is how it speaks to anyone who has ever felt rejected, unseen, or misunderstood. The creature becomes a symbol for all forms of marginalization, for anyone deemed monstrous because they don't fit the mold. This is where Del Toro's interpretation feels especially resonant. His Frankenstein isn't just about science, it's about empathy. It's about seeing the so-called monster as a mirror for our own failures of compassion. Silvia Moreno Garcia points out that the film and the novel are really stories about the horrors of parental neglect and abuse. When you think about it that way, Frankenstein isn't a story about science at all. It's about love withheld. The absence of care creates its own kind of monster. So in conclusion, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley remains one of my favorite books of all time because it operates on so many levels. And revisiting it in 2025 with the film version fresh in mind, and with texts like Laura Bates showing how our tech future is playing out now, I'm more convinced than ever that this novel matters deeply. In 2025, Shelley's vision feels less like fiction and more like prophecy. Her monster still walks among us, sometimes in machines and sometimes in ourselves. And if there's one lesson her story teaches, is that creation without compassion will destroy its maker. We are all Victor Frankenstein now. The only question is whether we'll keep running from our creature. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't yet. On this channel, I talk about horror books, typically through short reviews and recommendations, so if that's what you're into, definitely consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments what you thought about this video, especially if you're an existing subscriber of mine. I want to know if you all are interested in this type of long-form analysis on individual books, or if you still prefer my wrap-up and recommendation style videos. Thank you again for watching. Remember to be kind to each other, and I'll see you all in the next video.